Mushrooms to some symbolize the start of either the rise or the decline of the human race. The consumption of mushrooms was very necessary in the early days of man because it provided great nutrition. It was also very abundant, and unlike other organisms we use for food, it did not fight back or run away. But we have since evolved for more primitive ways as a species and found many other means for food. Aside from food, through the process of trial and error of finding out what is good to eat and what is not, we have come to find out that mushrooms have many other capabilities other than just nutrition. Among these abilities are the ability to make one mildly to intensely sick, the ability to heal one from a mild to intense sickness, and in some cases to outright kill. With the mastery of growing mushrooms nearly at hand, our interest in mushrooms has shifted out of an interest for its nutritional capabilities and into its interest for its other ones, namely its ability to house psychoactive compounds that, when ingested, will give you a psychoactive hallucination or trip. Mushrooms in the Hymenogestaceae family, entering the psilocybe genus, evolved to house one of these three compounds: psilocybin, psilocin, and baseocin. The psilocybe genus that houses these psychoactive compounds is more commonly referred to as shrooms and is found all over the world. It is actually theorized that these shrooms is what made humans into the complex society we are today. The stoned ape theory suggests that when humans were no more than great apes, that we found these mushrooms and had to ingest them, and this provided us with a trip, and the trip provided us with some level of existentialism, and any level of existentialism forces the mind to think in a more complex manner. We are also not the only species that have been known to take part in the use of psychoactive compounds. Among other species are wallabies in Australia that are known to eat farmers' poppy seeds, cats, and like the house cats that like obsess over catnip, and even extremely smart animals like dolphins get high by playing pass with a pufferfish with their noses. And these have all been confirmed to affect them on a psychoactive level. While it may have been beneficial in the long forgotten past, in today's recent history of the use of mushrooms has had a generally negative light on it, with some psychoactive partakers being diagnosed with psychosis and others being deemed as detached from reality or unproductive to society. And a few others are capable of going back to living their lives completely normal before they even tripped. However, I have come to support the realization that these negatives and cons of shrooms are actually extremely conditional and can be avoided by simply changing and controlling your perspective going into a trip and your mindset moving forward, allowing us to benefit from the many good qualities that are only available through shrooms while retaining none of the bad ones. One of the most feared negative effects from any psychoactive compound is psychosis, which can last forever and progressively get worse as time goes on. The main way it is achieved is through abusing psychoactive drugs day to day, leading to you losing your grip on what is real and what is not. Shrooms are no exception to this. However, psychosis can be completely prevented and combated in its early stages with nothing but one's own mental fortitude. The definition of psychosis is a mental disorder which makes you dissociate from reality. This possible symptom has arguably affected every mushroom partaker, assuming they took enough to trip. What most people don't actually understand is this is the whole reason of tripping. In small amounts, usually half to a full gram, the trip of mushrooms will be very similar to the high of marijuana. This is called microdosing. Although many claim the feeling of a high from microdosing is a lot more euphoric than weed, the high of mushrooms target your ego in a small amount just to boost it, to give it what most describe as a good yet incomplete feeling. It is anywhere above 1.5 grams that the ego is further boosted, strengthening your ego so that your thought perception influences your visual perception. And it is here that most have a more complete feeling, and the high is now considered a trip. The duration of these mushroom highs, anyone microdosing or tripping, usually lasts from 5 to 7 hours, but the intensity and trip duration can be lengthened by ingesting more mushrooms during or before the trip. But it's after the first 40 minutes to an hour you start to get a similar high to microdosing, but instead of the high continues to intensify and becomes a trip. And it may keep intensifying to a certain point, depending on how much mushrooms were ingested. But like I said, the trip targets the ego, the feeling of I am. But when at a trip level high, your ego's insecurities are also amplified, and the feeling of I am can turn into the feeling of am I. Amidst the ego being brought extremely high, the consciousness is also lowered. With the lack of certainty of state of being and spatial awareness brought by low consciousness, and possibly the foundational root of your ego's insecurities coming forth through visual and auditory hallucinations, it is simple to see how someone have an unenjoyable time. If the trip does amplify your ego's insecurities, then it may put one in a sad state. And this sad perspective it will influence your trip, making the things you hear and feel sad, making the things you hear and see feel sad or perhaps even scary. Because shrooms forge neural pathways in your brains that are actually much bigger and stronger than regular neural pathways, quite literally making your brain more faster and connected. The insecurities that are brought up can be something from long ago, like some long forgotten trauma that a person pushed out of their memory. This is actually the benefit of shrooms, and also the perfect time to clarify that shrooms are not for everyone. These mushrooms have a reputation of quite literally making one face their demons, and if you go into the trip expecting to see some cool colors, aliens, and more or less just have fun, then you run the risk of facing your repressed trauma unprepared. On the other hand, if you know what you're doing, then you can face this trauma head on, and you may even find yourself being able to completely move past it in life. Of course, regardless of your preparation, the trip can be extremely delightful and not target the scars of your ego. But that's not promised. And even when a good and blissful trip happens, it can change in an instant by something somebody says, a scene in a show or movie, or even a picture or drawing. Really, anything in your environment can change your mood and thus your trip. This catalyst doesn't even have to be inherently negative. It just depends on the way it makes you feel. And if it so happens this negative feeling that it gave you resonates with your ego at all, then you'll most likely find yourself in the previously mentioned bad trip situation. To prevent this, there are guidelines that one should follow if they find themselves in a situation where they are going to trip off shrooms. 1. Start with a small amount on your first trip. No one knows exactly what a shroom trip is like before they trip, and even intensity-wise, everyone is affected a little bit differently while tripping. Besides gauging the intensity of tripping, some people's bodies are just not compatible with some compounds, and shrooms are no exception to this. If you happen to be allergic, then it would be much better to take a small amount in case of emergency, so you will have better chances of surviving. Have a trip sitter. While the trip may amplify your thought process, it does not amplify your decision making. People tend to be much more susceptible while tripping, so it is important to have a trip sitter, which is more or less a babysitter, to make sure you have a safe trip. 3. Only trip with people you truly love. This is something that you really have to be careful about because your environment will decide your trip, and the people around you are probably the most influential part of your environment. As discussed, shrooms will pick up on the subconscious feeling, so even if you love the person, if you have any secret disgust or disdain for them, or just the way they carry If you have any secret disgust or disdain for the way someone does something, or maybe the way they carry themselves, that can be intensified and change your mood and thus your trip. It is important to be around people you truly love and trust and know. If you don't completely know someone, what you don't know about them can come back to haunt you as insecurities later on in your trip. 4. The most important rule is to have a meaningful reason to trip. Be prepared for any demons you may face, or rather go into the trip expecting to see them. If you don't have an idea of something you want to learn about yourself, or an event or experience you want to overcome, or a mindset you wish to change, then you risk facing any of these being unprepared, which has been traumatizing for many. 5. Think critically about your trip. While tripping, you have little consciousness. Your energy here should be spent in the moment, observing and accepting what is going on around you. Trips can be a little cryptic, and you won't think as critically while tripping, so just sit back, relax, and take as many mental notes as possible. Later, when your trip winds down, I encourage you to then think critically and consider what happened. Ask why it happened, what is it referring to in your life, and what happened, why it happened, and what it is referring to in your life. You should be able to answer the first question pretty quickly, but it may take weeks or days to answer the other two. You should also not be tripping during this time. You need to allow your mind to process everything completely, and once you understand the meaning of what happened, you then have a choice of implementing it into your life. If you return to this blind, then any revelations made at the end are usually incomplete, with no understanding of the real connection to your life or why it should be applied. And these revelations can be earth-shattering, forcing you to change the way you live forever. If you knew what you were doing, then you knew this would happen, and these are the results you would want. Reality is different now, but it's still real, it's just in a different way. If you don't know, then you're lost and confused, and your perception of reality is different with no explanation, making you feel like you entered a fake reality, or basically the start of psychosis. Surprisingly, psychosis is actually the only real lasting negative effect and can easily be avoided. There is a handful of minor effects like nausea and dizziness, and and dizziness that can be retained, but only while tripping. By the time your trip ends, so will these feelings, and the biggest risk of death is being uneducated in mycology and trying to forge means to go in the forest and find mushrooms, trying to. The biggest and perhaps only risk of death, unless you are allergic, is by being uneducated in mycology and going out into the forest or wilderness to go find your own mushrooms. This is because mushrooms come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors, and also have many differing effects. And some of the ones that have differing effects look almost indistinguishable from each other. So, for example, if you are trying to eat a mushroom that is good for nutrition or healing capabilities, or perhaps makes you trip, you may instead be eating a mushroom that can make you very sick or perhaps kill you if you do not know what you are doing. Apart from mental ailments like psychosis, shrooms have an interesting relationship with other ailments like addiction. Shrooms is one of few, if not the only drug that sparks no addiction. The people who come back to shrooms or claim to love them either know its capabilities on a mental capacity and have reason to trip, or they think it's a party drug and have not suffered from an unprepared, meaningful trip. But regardless of why someone trips, developing a chemical dependency like you would with other drugs is just unheard of. And in fact, it's the opposite. Shrooms actually develop a tolerance to the psychoactive compound that lasts a few days to a week to weeks. The tolerance gets stronger if you don't wait a few days to weeks in between trips, and it's actually cross tolerance, meaning that if you decide that you want to trip and use other drugs like LSD or acid, it will have a similar tolerant effect on those drugs as well. It is because of this that shrooms have become an increasingly studied method to combat depression. Looking to the future, shrooms deserve a chance to reveal their true potential. Under the right circumstances and with the right knowledge, shrooms can provide therapy for otherwise inaccessible trauma of the mind. Of course, this shouldn't become the leading method to treat depression and trauma, but if the source of hurt cannot be helped or reached by normal therapeutic discussions and methods, then there is a chance that you can reach the source with shrooms. Shrooms have this unique ability to open, connect, and divulge into the foundation of our ego. And it goes without saying that that alone deserves recognition, and that society would be foolish to just dismiss that. Understandably, shrooms cannot just be made legal and sold in stores, as not everyone is mature and knowledgeable about this topic. So, for made legal, it would be treated more or less just like weed, which I don't think that's what the world needs. However, in a therapy or counseling session with the right narrative, explanation, and understanding, I believe shrooms can become one of the best prescription medicines for dealing with mental illness, especially those that a patient cannot fully explain the source of their ailment, especially if it is by repression. Shrooms are not legal, so obviously I don't advise you to take them, especially if you have no purpose in taking them. However, I advise you to stop stigmatizing drugs. I do not blame you, as our country has finally given up the war on drugs, where trillions of dollars were spent for decades, all to spread lies and propaganda about these drugs and scare people away from them. But now we're moving out of the war of drugs and into understanding them. So I challenge you to drop your biases and practice research. While there are many drugs with adverse effects there are also a good amount that have little to none of these. Most of the time, these drugs tend to be natural as well. Things like weed, shrooms, and even DMT. At the very least, these drugs deserve the truth to be told about them, to be the truth about them to be known and understood, despite what it may be. It may bring about love and acceptance or hate and disdain for them. But regardless, both of these are better than lies because lies only create confusion.